Very good afternoon to you. Thank you for taking the time to attend this public lecture on a very, very rainy day. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Ross Tapsell. Ross is actually the director of the ANU Malaysia Institute, a new initiative of the ANU. And he's the author of a very important book on media power in Indonesia, Oligarchs, Citizens, and the Digital Revolution. Ross actually has a very interesting history. He has lived in Indonesia before and has actually worked for the Jakarta Post and the Lombok Post. As I mentioned earlier, the ANU Malaysia Institute was just established last year, and this represents a major investment in the Australian system in terms of setting up a specialized center to look at Malaysia and to understand Malaysia better in the coming years. So today, Ross will speak to us about new media and politics in Southeast Asia, social media, citizens, and the digital revolution. So I don't need to remind you that in Malaysia, with the upcoming general election, social media will again play a key role, and Ross will offer us his thoughts on how social media works, not only in Malaysia, but the rest of the region. Ross?
Thank you very much, James, and thank you everyone for coming. As James said, raining outside and Friday afternoon. I'm sure everyone is tired after a long week, so I promise not to talk for too long, and I've also got a few videos to show you some of the new media campaigning tactics that are happening in the region. And I'll try and have plenty of time for questions. So James, feel free to wind me up if you feel like the audience would like to interject or it's time for discussion. As a brief sort of introduction to reiterate James's point about the ANU Malaysia Institute, which is a new institute set up just last year to collaborate more openly and more strongly with partners in Malaysia, and also to make sure that the ANU remains a place of strong research on and about Malaysia. It has a long history of Malay studies and Malaysian studies, and we would like to make sure that keeps going in the 21st century. So it's great to be here at Sunway, a rising and important private university here in Malaysia, and it's wonderful to be invited to speak. So thank you to James and all involved. Any questions about the Malaysia Institute I can answer afterwards, and would be happy to chat with you more. Let me talk now about the main topic of my research. Let's just check this works. Beautiful. And I guess just to throw out my main research question to you here, and something which we can discuss, which is that in the first 15 years of the 21st century, it's been a time of astonishing advances in IT, including smartphones, social media, participatory media forms, to empower individuals to tweet, post, create, manipulate media, and coordinate messages online. As anybody who has a smartphone now, probably 50% of you using it at the moment, know we now have all this great individual access to new media. Yet despite these changes, democracy, a political system based on the idea of empowerment of individuals, has in these same years become stagnant in the world. And I think Southeast Asia is an excellent place to examine this paradox or this conundrum. And as many of you know, or perhaps your initial thought is, well, why would we expect smartphones to improve democracy? And that's a fair question. But it wasn't that long ago, really, that we were talking about the role of blogs and the internet, including in Malaysia, as being a place for greater freedom of expression and greater freedom of speech and media, and leading to political change. Even in 2011, anyone who's read anything on the Arab Spring, the role of the Twitter revolutions, or Facebook revolutions as they were called at the time, social media and the internet was the good guy. Now fast forward to 2017, and that's not really the case anymore. Social media has become the bad guy. And as you'll see in this presentation, I'll try and extrapolate a little bit as to why. So I think Southeast Asia, as I said, is central to this. My research, as James said, my book is about Indonesia. I've spent 10 years doing research on the Indonesian media, so that was a final product of 10 years of work there. My first research in Malaysia was in 2011, looking at, I guess, the history of the media freedom movement in Malaysia. But I've tried here for this talk, speaking in Malaysia, to look more broadly at Southeast Asia, look at Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And one way to think about the changes in how we think about the impact of social media or new media on democracy is this new term that was coined really in the aftermath of Donald Trump's victory and the Brexit decision, is this post-truth politics. In a very brief nutshell, post-truth being elections increasingly run on emotions rather than facts or policy details. And I think it's worth exploring this. I've got by no means got an argument which can't be debated, and I think that will make for interesting discussion later. But I think the concept or the term post-truth, which by the way was the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016, is worth reflecting on. And particularly in Malaysia, talking to a number of Malaysians, people say, well, post-truth has been around long before the internet in terms of media in Malaysia. So there's a good way to critique these. But in a brief nutshell, I guess some of the arguments of the dangers of new media or the problems of new media and democracy are first that the 24-hour news cycle means it's increasingly noisy and debilitating. As one presidential candidate in Indonesia said, democracy makes us tired. We're tired of all the bickering, the infighting, the racial and religious debates on social media. Things seemed a lot more ordered under a sort of stable regime, in Indonesia's case, in Suharto. And you can look at perhaps some of these authoritarian reversals or rise of the strongman type leader in Southeast Asia. Later we'll look at Duterte in the Philippines as perhaps a reflection that people do find new media and media generally in the region as chaotic, as constantly noisy, and that things seemed a bit more stable and ordered. Now, this is not necessarily to say that things were more stable and ordered under previous authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments, but social media can certainly add to that perception. We're also seeing, as we look at trust surveys in the region, declining trust in mainstream media and professional journalism. This is not just the case in Southeast Asia. This is generally the case around the world, linked particularly to the links between ownership and media bias, which of course leads to the view, as Donald Trump has pushed globally and is now very common from a lot of leaders around the world, that there is such thing as fake news and all news is fake. We have seen at the same time a rise of social media influencers becoming seen to be more reliable. And when you ask a bunch of people in the audience, perhaps it's worth sort of raising our hands now, how many of you in this room subscribe to and by subscribe I mean receive a print newspaper every day? There's about 4 or 5. That's not too bad, actually. I've seen lower hands. How many of you in this room, we might have a fair amount of students, how many of you do not own a television set? Do not own a television set? Yeah, more and more young people are not owning TV. How many of you check Facebook every day? Right. So these are some obvious changes that we're seeing. But what we're also seeing now is, if, for example, I was to ask you, how did you hear about a recent event in the news? We're increasingly saying the first time I heard about this was on Facebook or on WhatsApp. I'll talk about this later. So, of course, as social media becomes the prominent place for people to receive news and information, of course, political parties and interest groups and political actors are increasingly more involved in this space. So, as part of that, we're seeing campaigns and campaign professionals basing their campaigns on social media around sectarianism, divisiveness, and insecurity. Hence the conclusion, elections are decided on emotions rather than policy details. There's a sort of ABC of the post-truth argument. Let me give you, and more broadly, I guess, the idea that when we thought about social media as the sharing economy being a good thing, the sharing of news and information being a democratic thing, a bottom-up type force, which we'll talk about later. In fact, now scholars are starting to say that this sharing process has become manipulated and the internet has indeed become weaponized. I think that's probably a little bit too far in the strategic studies language, but it is some of the real dominant terms now being used to describe the internet. A couple of quick case studies, and then we'll sort of move through to some more broader general arguments. My first case study is to think about the Philippines election and the rise of now President Duterte. And I think the key message here, I'll really speed through these, but I think the key message there is to think about Duterte's election campaign as being the key aspect being his vision of the Philippines as being a narco state, and how that was reinforced throughout the campaign. And by narco state, what they mean, what his campaign professional said, was that unless you elect Duterte, then this country will, in his words, go to the dogs and be run by drug lords, and will be completely taken over by drug cartels, as is the case in his words, Mexico, Colombia, and various other countries. Now, when you actually look at the facts and the drugs in the Philippines, it's not Mexico. This isn't Colombia, and it's very much a perception of a state, perhaps to become, in his words, fractured, in decay, in decline. The future of the Philippines under threat, and so his strongman, neo-authoritarian campaign and policies around drug convictions has really questioned the impact of social media in being able to elect this kind of politician. And I think this is important to think about in the Philippines, because Facebook is huge in the Philippines. People are on Facebook more so than in any other country in the region, and one of the highest in the world in terms of usage. And also Facebook is free. So you really do have a campaign that was run in large part through social media, because Duterte didn't have a lot of money or campaign backing behind him. And a lot of it was done through Facebook. And a lot of it was done through Facebook influencers. And here's some examples here. I mean, some of these are similar to how you might think of Breitbart in the US and the Donald Trump campaign. People who are outside of mainstream media, who are constantly saying that mainstream media is biased and is against the candidate that you think should be elected. And the international media as well is against Duterte, is against his campaign and against the Philippines more broadly. And one of their constant messages is to reinforce this idea that they know the real truth. They have the inside information. And when you think about your Facebook feed as reading Facebook, it often comes up in your feed with your friends that it does seem rather reliable and trustworthy. So these sort of Facebook influencers were central to Duterte's victory. Again, the idea isn't that you're going to get mass support here. The idea is to establish a really strong and emotive base, as we saw with Trump or Brexit, and build from there. And these kind of new influencers, new media, new Facebook influencers are central to that message. So they consistently reinforce this idea that the Philippines is a narco state. And so now you had this strong campaign that the only way to overcome the narco state is to elect Duterte. And as we know, in the aftermath of his victory, we've seen these very strong and, in the case of sort of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, disastrous policies around drug shootings of drug users and family members. So a central part of the campaigns now are going to be Facebook. Now, the other thing to mention here is that in Southeast Asia, you now have millions of people who are really only using the internet for two things, Facebook and WhatsApp. So you have about, some estimates say about 100 million people who have a cheap Chinese-made BlackBerry, who are using the internet for the first time. And these aren't necessarily young Gen Y tech-savvy kids. These are people who have gone from semi-rural areas to semi-urban areas, and later I'll talk about Malaysia in this case. And these are people who, when surveyed, you say, do you have internet access? And many will say no. And say, well, do you have Facebook? And the same people will say yes. So Facebook is not seen to be the internet. They're not Googling things in extensive, they're not looking at YouTube videos. They're not really using it for sort of creating things, high bandwidth, that requires high bandwidth. They're really using it for the sharing of information. And we've just seen more recently in a global survey that for the first time since these surveys started asking these questions, when people asked what is the most reliable source of information that you receive, for the first time for about 20 years that they've been doing these surveys, personal sources was number one. Previously, you saw official sources as higher up, or mainstream media sources, professional journalism sources, as the top sources of information. Now, we're more and more likely to believe information that comes from our friends via WhatsApp or comes from our immediate Facebook feeds. This, of course, taps into the literature around echo chambers and filter bubbles that has been looked at in the West. But this is a trend happening in the region. Let me now give you a little bit of a break from me talking, and just to show you a couple of videos which epitomise my next case study, which is the Jakarta election. Now, it's important to look at Jakarta because Jakarta is obviously the capital of Indonesia, but the Jakarta election is probably the most important election behind the presidential election that will happen in Indonesia. The Jakarta governor is the third most important person in Indonesia, really, behind the president and the vice president. So the election here matters. The last Jakarta governor, as many of you in this room know, went from a mayor of Solo to become Jakarta governor, to then ride that wave all the way to the presidency of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, the current president. So I want to show you this video from 2012. And this is during the Jokowi campaign. Jokowi and Basuki, his vice president, were campaigning in Jakarta. And I want to reflect on what creatives and new media campaigners were doing in 2012 before I move to 2017. So let's watch this.
kenal hari, kiri kanan setoran gak berhenti-henti. Ku butuh Mas Jokowi. Macet Jakarta teratasi, ku mau pupuk Jakarta diberesi. Jangan lagi setoran kanan dan kiri. Ku mau Jokowi dan Basuki. Ku mau banjir diberesi, anggaran pembangunan gak dicomatin, rakyat miskin juga bisa diayomin. Ku mau Mas Jokowi, juga Mas Basuki. Jokowi dan Basuki.
Behind all of the jumping around and the, and the nice shirts and the silly faces, there's actually a fair few policy details there. When you actually look at what they're saying, you're talking about electing two officials. Yeah, sure, young, hip, and One Direction and so on. But when you're looking at what they're saying there, you're talking about we want corruption eradicated or at least addressed. We want flooding to be reduced. We want development funds to, be channeled in the right direction. And so this is sort of your young, counter-oligarchic, as I call it in the book, young digital-savvy creatives. They went on to establish their own sort of PR company, but who, through their volunteering and through their creative works, followed a policy-style campaign to say this is new, this is reformist, and this is going to be a good thing for the country. So this is sort of Jakarta election 2012. Jokowi and Basuki get elected. Jokowi then rides this wave all the way to the presidency, again, through the idea that he is a reformist and that his policies that he will bring through will be one of anti-corruption, one of building sort of infrastructure, and one who is not tied to the corrupt elite. Now, whatever you want to say about the Jokowi presidency now, of the expectations versus deliverables, you can say that generally speaking, he remains those three things. So Ahok then, or Basuki, or Ahok as he was named, the vice governor, as Jokowi goes on to become president, Ahok then is elected, then becomes the mayor. And when we fast forward to 2017, we see a very, very different campaign, and a very different campaign run through social media. The important point to make here is that in the lead up to the campaign, Ahok's effectiveness as a governor, or Basuki's effectiveness as a governor, was not in question. When surveyed, 75% of people said this man is doing a good job as governor. And even right towards the end of the election, most people agreed that he had done a very good job as governor. Flooding was reduced, there was less corruption. Even the sort of Ahok haters would say that he's done a reasonable job on a lot of matters. There were many reasons why you could criticise him on policies, and some of those did occur. But for the most part, he was considered as someone who was pushing for policy reforms. So, in 2000, just as a personal story, I remember talking to my colleagues in sort of late 2016 about whether it was worth going to Jakarta for the election, because it looked like that Ahok was going to win easily, and it didn't look like there was any serious competition, and it looked like also that he had these social media digital campaigners on side, and there was no one that was going to be able to challenge that. Well, as perhaps just goes to show that one should never predict elections in Southeast Asia, but as happened, Ahok then made a blasphemous comment talking about citizens should not be fooled by what people say is written in the Quran about voting for a non-Muslim candidate. This, of course, was recorded on YouTube and then cut and put out on WhatsApp, on Facebook, and his comments went viral. Of course, all of the Islamic groups jumped on that, and all of his political opponents jumped on him as well. So we then started to see a highly emotive, one would say conspiratorial campaign, which accused Ahok of being a communist, which accused him of being connected to the Chinese government. We also saw a number of new sort of fake news websites being created. Here's a list that I put together just to give some idea that we now have this blurring of websites or URL websites that they sort of look like they might be a professional journalism news. I mean, sawaranews.com sounds like it could be an online news site, but it's actually created purely for the purpose of really bringing down Ahok's popularity. You also saw this on the other side, to be fair too. There were sites that were created to bring down Ahok's opponents. But this is an important reflection when thinking about how news is shared in Southeast Asia. It can sometimes look like that it's reputable news sites, when in fact it's created purely for the purpose to look like it's reputable and to be shared amongst social media sites. It led, as many of you know, to 500,000 Indonesians on the streets of Jakarta on a number of occasions in December and February, protesting against the governor and saying that you should choose a Muslim candidate. So I attended one of these. These are my photos from the February rally, one of your classic sort of Indonesian cases where you've got imams up on the broadcasting, with their microphones saying that, hati-hati orang asing, careful of the foreigner. And down on the ground, a lot of people wanted a selfie with me. So there was definitely a disparity between what the official sort of messages were saying and how people felt about it. But I did find it very interesting. I've been to plenty of paid campaigning events in Southeast Asia for a number of years. So I know what a paid campaign looks like. And this definitely felt different. This was people who were there because their Muslim identity or Islamic identity meant something to them. Some of them were there protesting against, Palestine, Israel's involvement in Palestine. Some of them were there representing their local kampung or their local village. Some were there because they just wanted to express their religiosity, and some were there because they hated Ahok. So there was a plethora of reasons, and the best explanation I can give for that is perhaps it reflects the way in which we get into our little sectarian bubbles or our filter bubbles online. That when you see that in action, some groups here with banners, for one reason, talking about anti-communism, another group talking about, representing Muslim, Indonesian Muslims in the greater Muslim world. And they didn't always connect, but I guess that's how these campaigns now run. I can talk more about this later. But as you probably already know, this made for a very difficult campaign for Ahok. So faced with this predicament, faced with the idea that people think you're doing a good job as a governor, but you know that you're probably going to lose the election because polling data suggests he was going to lose. What do you do? And I guess you're faced with two choices. The first choice is say, no policy outcomes will win in the end. We keep with the message. Or B, accept that we are now in a sort of post-truth era whereby people are voting on emotions rather than facts. And finally, in a sort of desperate end to the campaign, they made this video. And I'll show you this one.
Saudara-saudaraku, seluruh warga Jakarta, waktu sudah mulai mendekat. Jadilah bagian dari pelaku sejarah ini dan akan kita tunjukkan bahwa negara Pancasila benar-benar hadir di Jakarta. Kita juga akan tunjukkan bahwa Bhinneka Tunggal Ika benar-benar bukan hanya jargon, tapi sudah membumi di Jakarta. Siapapun kalian, apa agama kalian, apa suku kalian, dari mana asal usul kalian, saudara-saudara semua adalah saudara kita sebangsa dan setanah air. Dan mempunyai hak dan kewajiban yang sama. Jangan tanyakan dari mana kau berasal. Jangan tanyakan apa agamamu. Tapi tanyakan apa yang telah kau perbuat untuk Jakarta.
Okay, any questions about any of that before I move on? I'm not sure if that was clear towards the end there. Don't ask where you're from. Don't ask what is your religion. Yeah, we got all of that. So ask who is the best for Jakarta. Think about how that's different from the first video that I showed. There's nothing there on really policy outcomes. There's nothing there on what he thinks other candidates might not be doing policy-wise. It's a very emotive campaign. And at the time, actually, I was asked, because again, these campaign videos are not shown in television, right? These are the most, I showed you the two most influential campaign videos in 2012 and 2017, and they're both all done online. They then get shown clips of on TV and on radio because they're so controversial or they're so influential, but they're not made for television, they're made for social media. So I remember being asked, what do you think about this? Because it's hugely controversial. And I said, finally, they're doing an election, they're doing a campaign on emotions because that's how they need to win if they're going to win. And I was wrong again. It backfired massively. Muslim voters saw the campaign as connecting all Muslims as terrorists or as violent extremists who are beating up Chinese. So it backfired massively and they had to pull the video. By that stage, it was too late. So the emotive campaign in that regard didn't work. Nevertheless, I think, skip forward to Malaysia. Nevertheless, I think that this is really important when we think about how do elections conceive the nation state. And we're saw this both in Philippines and in Indonesia. In the Philippines case, it was a nation under threat from drug lords, an outsider who was taking control of the country, and the citizens needed to wrestle it back in the hands of one man in particular, in this case Duterte. But the way that the campaign was around was, how do you conceive the threat to the nation, the threat of the state? Very similar messages in Jakarta. The threat of Islam being insulted, of outside influence from China or foreigners more broadly, or indeed the old bogeyman from Indonesia, the communists. This conspiratorial campaign run through social media, and the general idea of how do you situate your religiosity or Islam within your voting preferences. Very much emotive type campaigns. You also saw in both campaigns a sort of official campaign. Ahok's opponents never really addressed this issue specifically. You never heard them giving long speeches about Muslims must vote for a Muslim candidate. It was very much implied in their actions and their codes and their dress and so on. But the underground campaign, the unofficial campaign, is what wins elections now, which is very different to how we used to think about elections in the pre-digital era, right? What mattered was a debate and how you performed in a debate. What mattered was your sort of official branding, whatever that might be. Now we're looking at how do you come up with the most loud and controversial and insecure type campaign underground and filter that out through social media sites, never through official campaign tactics. So if we think about those sort of broader conclusions, what does that bring for Malaysia in 2018? How will the campaign spread? And will the state be under threat in Malaysia? Will we see these kind of things through unit media baru, for example, through cyber troopers in Malaysia, or indeed cyber troopers as argued by the opponents of the government, that there was a so-called Red Bean Army, DAP cyber troopers? What will be the role of new media campaigning in 2018 in Malaysia? Of course, Malaysian campaigns are not unique to having strong messages online through various, one might call them filter bubbles, either language filter bubbles or political party filter bubbles, or rural versus urban bubbles. And most of you in this room know most of this, so I don't need to explain this. But I think that will be the question to ask in 2018. What will be the official campaign and what will be the unofficial campaign? We saw some of this stuff in 2013, of course, but how will it escalate? And one would presume, as everyone in Malaysia said, that new media is now increasingly important to an election victory. Again, also, to think about the difference in rural-urban divide in terms of voting patterns, and to think about what does it mean for the millions of Malaysians who since 2013 have gained greater internet access, or are simply using internet mainly for WhatsApp and Facebook. Does that make a difference in semi-urban, semi-rural areas? So personally, I've got a map of the Malaysia electoral system. I've got a map of the internet access, and I've matched the two together to try and look at where are the areas that this might be interesting research. And I'm planning to travel around to these areas and look at the influence of WhatsApp type campaigning and Facebook type campaigning in these particular swinging seat areas. So again, the point being, I'm matching a swinging seat with a semi-urban, semi-rural internet role and putting them together. But in more broadly, as I sort of come to a conclusion, I think one of the ways to think about progression in the campaign is to think about, well, we've moved from internet chat groups to blogs to social media campaigning, to think about the role of WhatsApp in the election, also to think about these new big data companies that are now starting to be more prevalent in Malaysia. And I can talk more about this in the question time. But again, in the context, as I started this discussion, to think about is new media now becoming more weaponized in Malaysia? Or, as the economists put it just this week, new media is big, or bad, B-A-D-D, I think they call it. New media is big, anti-competitive, addictive, and destructive to democracy. So despite the sort of hopes that new media might be able to usurp standard campaign messages from, government-driven type of campaigns, is new media now the bad guy? One of these things that's coming around now is not just to think about pumping out messages, but is to think about how do you tie into emotions online. I just put this up as an example of a WhatsApp group that I did in Jakarta. But you can see that these companies aren't just looking at sort of, okay, what's your age preference, what's your ethnicity, so on. They're trying to look at various emotions, in that when you post something online, they're getting a gauge of your emotional character and what's important to you, who you're following. Do you follow a lot of religious sites, for example, on Facebook? Or do you follow a lot of economic sites, in which case they will kind of push messages in various ways? So, in conclusion, so that we have enough time for discussion and debate. First, the Philippines showed that post-truth populist victory is not limited to the West. When you look at most media studies scholarship around the world, it's very Western-centric. Most scholarship broadly is Western-centric, but particularly in media studies. It's horrible how everybody thinks whatever happens in Silicon Valley is all that really matters. Whatever happens in the West election is all that really matters. The Philippines shows that we can examine the concept of post-truth in Southeast Asia just as much as we can under Trump. I think the Jakarta election helped us better define it, because in this case, Ahok is your populist candidate. He is your straight-talking, anti-red tape official. So we often think of post-truth elections leading to populist victories. Ahok was the populist. Ahok was the guy who could cut through red tape. So what is important here, if we think about the context perhaps of, election candidates in Malaysia without naming names, there's nothing to say that a populist type leader will necessarily win a post-truth election. I hope that makes sense. Is democracy under threat? That's debatable. Huge voter turnout. So one of the things we can say about social media is it's getting a lot of people worked up and they really want to vote. So that's a good thing, perhaps. However, the problem is they're voting for undemocratic candidates in a lot of cases. So there's certainly a debate to be had about whether democracy is indeed under threat or whether new media, encourages people to get out and have their voices heard. Of course, this is a debate in Malaysia going on at the moment, right? That voter turnout might be lower than expected in 2013. But my prediction is, looking at other elections in the region, once the campaign fires up, you'll see a reasonable voter turnout, if not the same as 2013. But it seems to be that new media campaigns do push people out to vote. And perhaps one final, perhaps overly pessimistic, to be fair, conclusion, which is if social media is indeed causing the decline of democracy, I think perhaps Southeast Asia would be the first to fall. I say this in large part because Southeast Asians' ubiquitous use of social media and the also relatively weak professional journalism and mainstream media that goes on here means that if anywhere in the world is going to have the biggest impact around what the impact of social media can do to politics, Southeast Asia is the first place to look at. So, on that note, thank you for having me, and I hope that at least inspired a lot of sort of debate and discussion, and feel free to disagree with me and have your own opinions as we sort of talk more in the next 20 or 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ross. Any questions from the floor?
In terms of Jakarta, Duterte, and even Trump, there's no incumbent to protest or to protect. So using the media, it seems to be a one-way street. Whatever it says, like Jokowi, Duterte, Trump, is a way that there's no incumbent to protect. In the case of Malaysia, you have. In the case of England, you have an incumbent party protecting and giving out the opposing views. So maybe the role of the new media or the social media in different political systems may work differently.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah. A very good point. And there's a number of things which I think work differently. One of the big systemic differences, I suppose, between what you would say in Malaysia and Indonesia or Philippines is also the role of media owners linked to political parties, which it leads to direct media owners running for politics. In terms of incumbency, though, I guess the argument that the current Indonesian president is having, and that Ahok had in his election campaign, which I think Najib would be worried about here, is that new media does push for new candidates. And incumbents, it's harder for incumbents to talk about change and talk about a new, voting for something new and exciting, which is what a lot of new media campaigning is about, right? You know, this is something new, or this is something that needs to be changed. So I do find perhaps it's harder for incumbents in the digital era. In Australia, of course, we've gone through about 5 different prime ministers in the past, 7 years or something. So perhaps I'm biased in terms of the difficulty in retaining office.
My name is Un from Shah Alam. The video from Ahok, the first scenes showed riots going on, something like what happened in May 1998.
Right.
So Ahok was obviously trying to remind people and plant fear there. But the organizers of the Muslim groups in Indonesia, which gathered the 500,000 people in Jakarta, and like you say, it wasn't a paid campaign. I think many of them came with their own accord. And the leaders emphasized that it's going to be a peaceful rally. They're not going for violence. They are conscious of the rise of Islamism in this part of the world. And they do want to put the message across that whatever change they want is going to be peaceful. So do you think Ahok's message was being mysterious? And because of that, it was one of the factors which backfired on him? Thank you.
Yes. In a Simple answer, yes, it was too far, right? And certainly the people that he was trying to win over, which is your sort of your moderate Islamic voter who isn't against the idea of voting for a non-Muslim candidate, is that Ahok is going to, by having videos and sort of making this over the top, he's only creating more problems. So yes, that's a strong reason why it backfired. However, I did think that, you know, when you looked, and I saw some of the banners there, right? And there were journalists who were roughed up and beaten up, and there were a couple of people that got pushed around who were there. You're right, it was 99% completely peaceful, but the banners themselves were not. You know, there was plenty of banners there saying, you know, burn Ahok, you know, anti-Chinese type banners, anti-communist type banners. So yes, I think it went too far, but I do think that there is, you know, I can see perhaps what they were trying to do. But yes, that is essentially why it failed. It was seen as too far and it didn't win over the sort of more middle ground voters. Because a lot of people who criticised Ahok criticised him for being far too controversial, you know, saying things that he shouldn't say. Even the political party leader, Megawati Sukarnoputri, said, I wish I could just shut his mouth sometimes, right? And this was another case where it, you know, perhaps went too far. So yes, I agree with you.
Just a reflection now. If you look at, generally speaking, the young crowd, these are the people who come against, you know, the corruptions and don't feel good about the social and looking for the future and things like that. You know, all the events and all the videos that we saw earlier, it was all run by the young children, if you look at it, on how they want to do this thing. And these are the people who are also, you know, very active on social media and things like that. Now, the percentage of the younger population we are talking about, how do you see that influencing the performance versus emotion? You know, we have a strong case here wherein, as a governor, a fantastic performance, 75% said, yeah, good one, but there's an emotional part of it. Now, something is not really falling in line when you look at the numbers versus the response, yeah? So, between performance and the emotions, and the demographic in terms of the age distributions and the internet reach and things like that, how do you solve? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a difficult, you know, wide-ranging question. I do think from the outset that there is a problem a little bit in some of these surveys around incumbency and around are you satisfied? In fact, Southeast Asians, you've probably seen in recent Pew surveys, Southeast Asians are always really high up in satisfaction, whether it's health, happiness, education, and indeed government. They're often very high when you compare with other countries. I think there was one survey I was told recently where when you look globally at Indonesia's education performance, Indonesia is only slightly ahead of Kazakhstan as being the worst in the world. But when you ask, are they satisfied with their education, it's actually one of the best in the world. So I think there is a survey response to sort of say, yeah, we're happy. So perhaps, you know, we can question those survey data a little bit. What I think is important is to compare them alongside each other. So what we're seeing now in trust surveys is looking at, do you trust the police? Now, around 65%, I think, in Southeast Asia, 65% of people say, yes, they trust the police, which is enormously high. When you ask anyone individually, do you trust the police? Often they'll say, of course not. But 65% high. But that's the lowest of all of those surveyed. And the media is just above that. So the TNE, the army in Indonesia, is always really high up. So mainstream media has dropped when you look at other rankings. So anyway, that's just a broad comment on rankings. Age distribution is very interesting. When we look at WhatsApp data and when we interview people on WhatsApp, we often find that younger generation of people are pretty digitally savvy for the most part, right? And they are using WhatsApp a lot, but they're not sharing a huge amount of conspiracy theories. And they often complain that the most likely way that they're receiving these crazy sort of conspiracy theories is from their uncle or their aunt or their family WhatsApp group or their mother and those kind of things. So I think there's a lot to be said for an older generation in the sharing economy of Southeast Asia. When you think about how kampung works, right? You often passed on information and gossip to people in your other kampung. And I think that sort of just moved online for that generation. The idea that, yeah, this might be complete rubbish, but I'm passing it on anyway. Or, yeah, I saw a great one that parents were sharing to their kids about to beware of Pokemon Go, because you will become addicted and fall in front of a bus because you're using Pokemon Go too much. And parents were sharing this really enthusiastically with their younger people. And most of them sort of say, well, yeah, I know, I'm pretty sure my kid wasn't going to fall under a bus playing Pokemon Go, but I just wanted to share it anyway. And so I think that generational difference around sharing is worth studying a bit more, and particularly when we look at conspiracy theories in election campaigns. Often it's shared through older generation rather than young.
Good afternoon. My name is Muhammad Sinatra, and I'm from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS Malaysia. As an Indonesian myself, I get a lot of questions regarding what were the roles of, I despise the term moderate Muslims during the Ahok episode in 2016 and 2017, because if we look at the data, the combined membership of Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah could amount to well over 100 million. But as the Ahok episode shows that their popularity just like plummeted in the face of FPI's voice and Forum Ulama Islam FUI or something like that. So I just would like to your comment on what happened to NU and Muhammadiyah, especially as we face as we are welcoming the Pilkada in June, regional elections.
Pilkada's in June, yeah, sure.
Thank you.
I think it's important to reflect broadly in the region that some of these religious organisations are perhaps not as powerful in influencing people's votes or decisions as they might make themselves out to be. And of course, the Indonesian president, Jokowi, has both Muhammadiyah and NU within his sort of circle, and Muhammadiyah and NU both said to their citizens, to their followers, do not go to this rally in Jakarta. We do not support this rally. We would prefer you stay at home. And of course, a lot of people just ignored it. So the idea that if you have religious organisations within your inner circle, you're therefore going to win over those voters, I think is a mistake that is being made broadly, but in particular around NU and Muhammadiyah. But they are still influential. But it's interesting that when we look at Pilkada for 2018, I think a lot of people are also saying, well, yes, if we can get these groups. The interesting will be, will Jokowi nominate an NU leader as vice president? And I think that's on the cards. Whether that makes a difference, though, as automatically buying or gaining Muslim votes from doing that, I think that's very questionable.
Hi, I'm a guru from WWF. What are your thoughts on the recent changes in how the Facebook feed works? Now they want to emphasize content between friends and family over media and brands. And do you think it's effective in combating so-called fake news? And how would organizations leverage a declining Facebook reach environment?
Good question.
Thank you.
Right, yeah. So this came out in the aftermath of 2016 presidential election. Facebook's desperately worried that they're actually doing more harm than good. In fact, even Mark Zuckerberg publicly said, I apologize to all my sort of Facebook community where I have done more harm, where my company is doing more harm than good and promoting sort of identity politics. So they said, right, in order to do that, what we need to do is get Facebook back to what it was when it started, which is really that you're sharing information from friends and not political interest groups. The other idea with that then is that it potentially reduces the ability of campaign professionals to pay Facebook for advertising to target people around those sort of emotion and identity politic views. That's sort of the vague idea. However, when universities have done, and I think Facebook as well, have done control groups around this, what they actually found is that you were more likely to share fake news and conspiratorial news when you only had your other friends in that group. So the danger is they're going ahead with it anyway because they'd rather news be shared through friends rather than through political interest groups and, you know, influencers like I mentioned in the Philippines. But the danger is that we are in the same reason that WhatsApp is huge for sharing conspiracy theories. There's nothing in WhatsApp in the algorithms which can manipulate what people see for political interest, right? It's pretty much down to what people decide to share or not. Yet WhatsApp is one of the strongest places for sharing conspiracies. So I'm not sure it's going to make a major difference, but it may be useful in reducing the way that political parties or political interest groups can target you on your newsfeed, because it's more likely that you'll come up with friends.
All right, hi, I'm Jane from Sunway College. Just have a question regarding Duterte. I remember last year when there was the whole thing about him, the shoot to kill and all that, about his drug war and all that. There was a lot of news, international news about human rights, and these were from professional media, from news outlets internationally condemning his actions. But domestically, according to what is reported locally, the locals approve of what he's doing. If I'm not wrong, there was like a 90% approval rating and all that. And then there seemed to be a disparity because in YouTube, there are also videos of the authorities and people shooting suspected drug abuse users and all that kind of thing. So I couldn't reconcile the international side and the local side of perspectives, because it's not only the regular people that are supporting what he is doing. Even highly educated people from people that are staying abroad, Filipinos abroad, are agreeing with what he's doing. So I can't really balance that and how the media portrays all these things. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So two things on the media side. I mean, we could get into long debates about supporting of death penalty and so on in Southeast Asia, but I'll avoid that really for now. But two things on the media side. The first is we are seeing now leaders in Southeast Asia, again, without naming names, but Duterte would be one of them, who are very keen to quickly condemn the international media as being biased and, you know, anti-nationalist and anti the nation state of Southeast Asian countries. So again, part around that idea that it's this, you know, fake news campaign. So that is now far more prevalent. We saw that in Suharto's time as well, and Marcos's time. But it's certainly a strong narrative to say that if you are sort of a nationalist Filipino or a nationalist Indonesian or Malaysian, you won't believe that international conspiracy press. The other thing to recognise too in Duterte is that you are starting to see crackdowns now on local media that is dissenting against his presidency. And Rappler is now, most famously this week, it's likely that its license will be revoked, Rappler being one of the few organisations that regularly speaks out against those policies, those drug policies, and the police shootings, constantly, you know, putting a tally as to how many have been killed. In fact, they've got a reporter who works on this full time, which a lot of, you know, mainstream media is generally not uncritical of Duterte. So we're seeing that, you know, broadly in the region. We saw in Malaysia the removal of the license of the Edge for a short time when critical of Najib, and it looks like that we're seeing removal of licenses more of critical media in Southeast Asia generally. Cambodia is disastrous at the moment in that regard.
Hi, my name is Sophie Lomière from Harvard University. I'm working a lot on the question of rumors in politics, recently relabeled as fake news. And I was wondering, I looked mostly at the Malaysian case and the spread of rumors of a potential ISIS attack, especially on the day of birthday demonstration downtown KL.
All right.
And this would be spread through text message and WhatsApp, etc. We've seen that as well a lot with the potential conversion of, you know, Muslim kids to Christianity, etc., etc. So I was wondering whether this is a phenomenon that you see as well in the Philippines and in Indonesia, and if you have any, you know, ideas about. Of course, those rumors are anonymous, and rumors are anonymous by definition. But a lot of people are saying that it's, it could be coming from the States, could be coming from telephone companies who are linked to the government, etc. So if you could just, give us a few ideas about that.
Give some ideas about where do the rumors begin?
Where
sort
does
of.
it begin? And
Yeah.
then if you observe the same phenomenon in the Philippines and
Oh, yeah,
Indonesia
yeah.
or, other part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's hard. It's hard to know. Let me just try and think of one example, use one example in Indonesia, right? So one of the big debates and words used in the Indonesian election campaign was this term pribumi, right? You probably saw some of that. And a lot of that was circulated via WhatsApp and Facebook and so on, Pribumis are being taken over by Chinese. Pribumis are not running the economy and the government, this kind of thing. And I was interested as to where this came from. And following the trail through WhatsApp, you actually can see there's a group, Gerakan Pribumi Indonesia, that was seemingly formed around the Jakarta election time. And they've got a website and they've got a bunch of people that they list as being part of this Gerakan Pribumi Indonesia. And they're very vocal, being quoted in some of those websites that I showed you that were generally, not professional news media, but they get shared around talking about the dangers, and Pribumi has to be aware of how they're being subjugated by foreign influences. I think the easiest way, again, it's very hard to get hard evidence on this, but it seems to be that these groups do pop up and they're very vocal and they're getting paid by someone, right? Maybe minimally, or maybe in the aftermath of an election victory, things come through, and you can look at them and see who they quote in these mainstream media. And I did that, and who are they actually often talking about, as well as talking about Pribumi? Who's the savior of the Pribumi, for example, and then sort of draw a correlation and say, well, it looks like he's, this person's paying this group. Of course, it's impossible, really, unless you got them to admit it as to how this works. But that's generally how you start a conspiracy campaign, or at least push a message like a Pribumi type message. You create a group, they create a website, there's a bunch of people, and they look official. So when you're sharing this stuff, oh yes, right, this is the Gerakan Pribumi Indonesia group. I'm going to share that, and it sort of looks like that it's a kind of semi-formal organization, and it seems to work. You often see on WhatsApp, as you probably already know, I'm preaching to the converted here, but, health type information. And it'll be, Dr. James Chin from the medical school advises that you should eat 4 avocados a day to have a good heart rate. And you'll ask Dr. James Chin if did you do this? No, I didn't. Someone just borrowed my name to make it look official. So there's a lot of that going on too, where officials and professionals are having to deny that they actually passed out these recommendations. So it's fascinating in all forms, politics, health, in all sorts of fields.
My name is Yi. I would like to ask a tough and tricky question. I know you do not have the crystal ball. I'd like to know what's your take or prediction of our coming general election.
That's the reason why you have a large crowd.
Yeah, right. Well, let me caveat any answer with that with saying that I predicted that the Jakarta election would be boring, that Ahok would win easily, and that video was an excellent representation of how to win a campaign. So I think I've also once mentioned prior to 2016 and these big rallies that the era of mass protests in Indonesia seemingly had ended after Reformasi, and a couple of months later everybody was out on the streets protesting. So I think my predictions are pretty minimal. Perhaps a good one for Professor Chin, being the Malaysian politic expert. But let me just say this much, that what I think will be really interesting for media studies scholars, and indeed for myself, and more broadly around campaign tactics, is to look at the influence of new media in the campaign, and in particular, WhatsApp in semi-urban, semi-rural areas. My feeling is that the opposition at the moment, doesn't have the strong online support that it had in 2013. And I can see that even just talking to people more broadly in Kuala Lumpur, where I've only been so far, there isn't the same amount of energies and enthusiasm and perhaps angst or anger that I saw in the lead up to 2013. So, take that as a, very, again, in the lead up to Jakarta, I had predictions that failed, and that could be wrong here. But it does seem like that the mass online mobilisation that we saw in 2013 from the opposition is not as organised, as well funded, or as strong as it was in 2013. On the other side, with Barisan Nasional, I think that they're doing a far more professional, far more comprehensive, and far more interlinked job around new media than they did in 2013. I think in 2013, they were still unsure what they were doing in new media campaigning. Now I think they know exactly what they're doing, and I think they're doing it pretty well. So that would lead, in my opinion, to a more comprehensive BN victory. But take that prediction as it comes. I'm not sure. Yeah.
You're talking about the Pribumi in Jakarta, their campaign, where they are being paid and whatnot. How is that different from American model of lobbyists? Sure. And there are, organization in America, foundations used to feed on Islamophobia, professionally financed, right? Yeah. How do you see that different from what you have explained just now? And on top of that, with regards to the 2 million solidarity in Indonesia, do you see it in the works of only Islamis or as well as the moderates? Because Andu and also had in fact tell their followers not to come, but eventually everybody did, almost everybody. I read one account from this guy who is a famous celebrity in Indonesia. He's one of the hosts of a singing show in Indonesia and DAA Asia, and he was talking about his account, walking for a few kilometers just to show that, hey, we are Muslim, you should not be saying things about us as you like, as you wish, just to show solidarity. And I consider him to be a moderate. So how do you see that? It's only a moderate affair or equally balanced affair of Indonesian Muslims?
Yeah,
thank you.
Sure. I guess the first question is, you make a very good point about some of the lobby groups that go on in America. I don't personally do research on American politics, so it would be hard for me to give a fair comparison between the American political system and the Indonesian one around these type of campaignings. But I think it's a fair point, and I think we're seeing a lot of this stuff go on in the Trump campaign, right? And the anti-Muslim sort of underground new media campaign was very much prevalent. So in a lot of ways it's not different, but again, I don't research on that personally, so I don't have any facts or data to give you. The second question around sort of moderate versus hardline is really difficult to answer. And I think one way to think about this is there was huge debate amongst scholars ourselves as to why is it that people protested in Jakarta. There was sort of one group that was saying it was an anti-Chinese, clearly an anti-Chinese rally, clearly an anti-Ahok rally, and there was an element of racism within that protest. Sort of one group was saying that. Another group was saying, actually, the racism, the Chinese thing, that was minimal. It was a peaceful rally. It was a prayer rally. It was one where people were expressing their religiosity, and actually it was quite moderate in what went on. And I don't think we've decided as a group of scholars as to what those rallies really meant. I think it's going to take time, and I think we're only going to really know when the 2019 election hits. And we see, was that Jakarta election an anomaly where you had the triple minority of a Christian Chinese anti-corruption governor, in which case people just protested at Ahok, and who was very loud and quite abusive in many ways in some of his speeches. And so the Ahok case was an exception to the rule. Perhaps that's the case. And once we go back to sort of normal programming in 2018, Pilkada in 2019, we'll see that elections are far less around identity politics. And I just don't think we can answer that yet, hopefully in the future.
And on that happy note, can I ask all of us to thank Ross the usual way?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. So this concludes our session this afternoon. And